Well, I think I've introduced all speakers on the panel already, apart from Professor Kai Konrad, who is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Tax Law and Public Finance in Munich, and he's been with CONVOCO before. Well, I guess we can start right away after the presentation. Professor Kirchhof, maybe you want to start off. Righto, I've heard your presentation and you were pleading for freedom and the rule of law. Let me tell you what my perspective is. I am a teacher at a university. I'm a lecturer, a professor, and I'm confronted with students who make mistakes. And it's their very chance to make these mistakes so that I can correct and help them. And the best to happen is when students find a mistake made by the professor. So we act and we know that we make mistakes. The students don't fail. At the end, the professor does not fail either, because everybody is brave enough to move on in spite of the fact that one might make mistakes or fail. Now, getting back to your presentation, let me tell you, you've talked about the freedom of banks and the chance of banks on the market. Banks that respect freedom, which implies responsibility. In other words, banks that make mistakes have to be held accountable and accept this responsibility, which would, if put into practice, mean a fundamental change of our financial regime. So we have the freedom of the bank and a government that respects the freedom of the bank, however, does not have any money to pay to the bank in case of mistakes. Because taxpayers' money is normally not meant to be paid to banks that fail. The taxpayers pay tax in order to fund infrastructure, streets, roads, whatever. In other words, the whole system only works with a clear distinction and a clear separation or divide. On the one hand, there's the government. On the other hand, there is the financial system. In Germany, we've changed the constitution. We changed it in 2009, and it now includes the duty of the state to not incur any further debt and to start with the repayment of the debts of the past from 2012 on. Sorry, 2011 on. Actually, Germany has not started to pay back its debt. As I said, this was meant to happen in 2011, and the question is, of course, what now? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, the scenario is such as a beautiful one because we don't pay back the loans, but then no economic activity will happen anymore either. So there is a system which involves freedom and responsibility, including the credit agreements. And in order to make sure that the whole system works, one has to have a different approach with respect to the private economy. Otherwise, the system will fail. Now, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was extremely inspiring for me, and I could hardly keep myself from standing up and making intermediate statement. Now, we are dealing with what I'd label a mésalliance, a wrong type of relationship between the government and the banks. The peoples that lived 400 years ago, the Belzers, the Foggers, and others. You have lots of states that failed with the banks. In other words, this is a very old story. Now, the banks are one of the main sponsors of states. States, on the one hand, want to have more regulation. On the other hand, they depend on the home buyers you've mentioned about. And I think German banks hold about 80% of the German state funds. So this is a closely connected system. The question is, what about the politicians? I mean, are the politicians truly aware of the interfaces or the interlocking? I remember an email sent by Per Steinbrück. Made a proposal for a public insolvency procedure. And obviously he had read this proposal, and when he answered, he referred to footnote number 27. So obviously he had read the text. However, he did not really ask questions concerning the proposal. He only wanted to know what will happen to the banks and with the banks. Well, obviously, we are dealing with the state's role and the way the state deals with risk, including the risk of failure, which is probably also what was in the focus of the presentation. In a positive setting, the state does not matter there where institutions fail, because normally there is a risk of failure, and of course the institution is responsible for its activities, which we could label the principle of coincidence. In other words, there is a congruency or a coincidence of action, intervention, and the risk, including the risk of failure. Now, as Mr. Rocholl has told us, this principle, is being violated, so to speak, and it has been violated for ages already, because the government adopts responsibility or assumes the responsibility there where it should not assume the responsibility. It claims a systemic risk and says the government has to save the banks. The problem is there is no honesty in our approach with respect to the risks that exist, which means that the taxpayer does not trust the state and public institutions anymore. Remember 2010, the rescue of Greece. It was a well-meant attempt, bearing in mind the systemic risk. The government said, well, let's try and protect Greece in order to then change the system and do it better. However, nothing has happened in the last 3 years, and people have lost trust in the government. And the overall development is even less than it used to be. In other words, the states saw the risk, tried to overcome the risk, still sell public bonds, in spite of the fact that these are extremely risky securities. There are many reasons why the government embarks on this particular investment and is increasingly doing so, and the government does whatever it can do in order to destroy whatever has been left of the trust. I would be able to give you 3 more examples to show what I'm talking about. For example, Jean-Claude Juncker, who talked about confidence-building measures and a particular relationship between the government and the citizens. And he said, well, if it gets worse, if it gets bad, you have to lie, even if you are a statesman. I mean, even if he is right, it's not really smart to say so publicly. And his successor did the same with respect to the Cyprus crisis. He said, well, this could become a role model for the state debt in Europe in order to then change his mind and tell the public that he is not convinced of this particular approach anymore. And then I also lose trust in the activities of the Troika. We looked at the gross forecasts of the Troika in the last 3 weeks. Sorry, in the last month, they proposed 9 different forecasts. It always starts at -4. That's usually the starting point. And then it rises, and within 2 years, you get +2. It's not a linear process, but it's a rising curve. Now, the only modification of the curve is it moves to the right. Once every 4 or 5 months, it moves to the right. I mean, of course, we all know it's hard to predict economic trends, but I don't have to look at Greece or go to Greece in order to publish such a forecast. And if I see such a forecast, I cannot take it at face value, but I have to take it seriously, of course. Now, I was less daring than you were. And I mean, I'd been asked to speak no more than 90 seconds, and that's why I stopped after 90 seconds, whereas you went on and on. Let me take the floor once again. Therefore, we had the PSI, we had the debt cut early in early 2012, and we had the lack of trust and the uncovering of a lie according to which public funds, state bonds were safe and secure, which was a lie and which became clear already some time ago. Now, today, we are dealing with the OSI, the official sector involvement. That's the latest acronym adopted in January. And that's what we will see in the next weeks, which gets, again, the taxpayer on board, because the taxpayer has to pay for it. Now, there are 2 aspects. On the one hand, the government should not go and mitigate the risk of banks. And secondly, the state should not borrow money. There is a difference between states or governments and private debtors, because, or entrepreneurs for that purpose, because governments are not productive units. They do not go and produce something which they sell in order to make money, in order to pay back the loan. In the case of states, it's different, because the state has to raise taxpayers' money in order to pay back the loans. And according to the German basic law, the constitution, the government has to get back to a form of funding which is based on the following principle: I spend the money which I raise by means of tax. I only spend the money I earn or gain, taxpayers' money, so to speak, which also implies that the citizen can only claim from the state what he or she pays for. I pay my tax, and the government spends the taxpayers' money on infrastructure, school, etc. So far, it's been different. People are paying in order to have the government pay back its interest rate. It's not even a repayment of the debt, which is why the banks do not mind when governments are indebted. And that's why we have to intervene again. Freedom means responsibility, which you can easily see if you look at private entrepreneurs. And if you adopt such a system, you can as well adopt a system of modest taxation, which would then, of course, imply modest services, public ones. Now, the central banks also like state bonds in order to have securities for their activities. They are maybe the only ones that still love state bonds. Now, let me intervene once again, because people tend to say it's so difficult today, but remember 1949, the houses destroyed, the men dead, or prisoners of war. The ministries said, we don't know whether we will survive this winter. And then our grandparents wanted to establish a new country, a new state, a free and responsible one. And they even went and rebuilt the Julius-Turm in order to later sponsor an army. I mean, that's, of course, what you have to do if you provide the potential. Let me give you one figure. Germany between 1949 and 2008, and it makes sense to read the balance sheets until 2008. Afterwards, we have to adopt a different approach. Had credits amounting to 1.6 billion and paid interest, an interest amounting to 1.5 billion. Now, this is short-term liquidity. In the long run, the interest rates and the credit as such are more or less the same. The government loses its internal sovereignty, has to accept the assessment by the rating agency, and that's the core problem of our system. Now, you're right to remind us of the early years of the Federal Republic of Germany, 1949, and the 1950s, but I would like to remind you of the London debt agreement. And it's worthwhile looking back at this particular agreement. Germany wanted to rebuild the country, and it was passionate about it, but it only worked because the winners of the war decided to not insist on the payback of the debt. And that was the London Agreement. And that's why there are many people out there who should not say, why should we help Greece today? I mean, not here in this hall, but outside, there are many people who say we should not help Greece. And that's why I would like to remind you that hadn't the Allied forces helped Germany, we wouldn't have been able to build the system we've built. But there are two more events. I would like to remind you the hyperinflation of 1923, which was actually an insolvency. It was a major shifting of debt, and it was not a voluntary process. It was not like the creditors went and said, you're not doing well, so you don't have to pay back anything. But it was an inevitable situation, an insolvency. Germany would not have been able to pay its dues. And the same happened after World War II. So it was not the generosity of the allies. It was allies who realized that the country as a whole had been bombed and was not capable of producing enough in order to pay its dues. Of course, there were possibilities of generating funds for the reparation works and the recovery of the country from export business, but an export business only runs smoothly once the national economy works well. So it was not a completely voluntary waiver. It was a matter of fact, so to speak. And in Greece, and I hope that I don't have to read this in the newspaper tomorrow, the facts concerning Greece are similar. And Greece will most probably not be able to pay back its debt. And I wouldn't rely on it. So I try to word it in a careful way so it doesn't become the headlines tomorrow. Right, we still got the message. Now, I don't want to paint it black and white. And I do not want to insinuate that these were benevolent or generous creditors only, but we should also remember the energy, the power, the forces we triggered so that investment became possible at all. There is the psychological dimension, I'd say. Now, this is certainly about standards and possibilities to get out of this particular dilemma. Now, norms or standards are based on what we'd label a normal situation, which is why, for me, today in 2013, a lost war does not matter anymore. However, we have to deal with Greece. And here we have to apply completely different standards because the ideal situation we have just defined with respect to other countries does not apply to Greece anymore. We cannot go and tell the Greeks, well, you let your banks do and they will get out of the mess somehow. We have to consider the international law, and we know that they are entitled to a state, a government. This is a democratic situation, and Greece is also a member state of the European Union, and we are neighbors, so to speak. So we have to make sure that they enjoy the wealth and well-being we enjoy here. So we have to find out how our way of dealing with each other is changed so that Greece gets support. And we must assume that in the process, the structures will improve. And I would like to give you 3 examples because we should talk about concrete aspects. Now, first example. If the Greeks try to really save money, but then have to give away 100% of what they saved to the financial market, they lose everything. They are obliged to do so, but this is not encouraging. The Greeks save money, but they do not have any benefit as a result. They try hard, but they don't get any reward or recompensation. So I'd say that at least 30% of the money they save should be used for schools, streets, hospitals, etc. Because there are many structures that don't work there anymore. So that the Greeks see with their very eyes that there is a chance to get out of this mess. Second aspect or example. People tend to say that Germany is strong. in spite of the overall debt that amounts to 82%. Germany doesn't even try to reach the 60% indebtedness, which is the rate according to the law. There should be solidarity. So if Germany is strong, i.e. recovered, there should be solidarity. And thus Germany should go and say, should tell Greece, we give you money, and if eventually we need your money, you should be willing to give it to us. Third example, structural reforms need unanimous decisions. This is one of the fundamental principles of the EU treaty. Unanimous decisions we only get if the banks in London agree to what we want to do. And the banks in London will never agree because they don't use the euro. They have their own currency, which means that we have to decide whether we want to take the money and pay to Greece without knowing what will come out of it. I mean, we are dealing with a real problem already today, as you have heard. And the question is, do we give the money to Greece, or do we give the money to potential investors who want to invest in Greece and create jobs and work on patents and produce? So normally, I'm against subsidies, in particular subsidies taken from the taxpayers' money. But here we have to really solve a problem. And that's why I wonder whether there are no better ways to do it.
Well, I think we agree when it comes to the diagnosis that the euro is on the path to failure. Whether it fails in the final analysis is something that history will decide. Politicians will have a say in that as well. I am less confident when it comes to the path that you have just described to us. This type of economic control, investment control, and the control of economic forces is not something that has a success story that we can look back at. Think about the Lisbon process within Europe. I think you can say that this was a complete failure. Europe should become the most competitive region worldwide within just a few years' time. I recognize the target, the goal, but I don't think we've come any closer to that since this was defined. I have the impression that when Brussels uses money and carries out investment controls, I think this will most probably be spent in a nonsensical manner because it will not develop productive forces. If I transfer this to Greece and somehow I have the problem that countries should solve their own problems and we shouldn't provide the problem solutions to other countries, well, this applies not only to the euro crisis, to the climate crisis and other crises. It's always good to try to come up with solutions for others. Well, I'm very skeptical when it comes to that. The world is different. Paul Krugman got a Nobel Prize for talking about the benefits of agglomeration. These benefits are very important. It's not just a question of people going to Eastern Germany to invest because things are less expensive there. No, they invest in Munich, where property is most expensive. And this shows us that the economy works differently. We have major benefits of agglomeration, and we see that the economic forces grow best where it is already present. And to counter this phenomenon is very expensive, and I don't think that it is very promising. I think it's better to give the Greeks people who are productive and who want to work hard, who are creative, who are entrepreneurs, they should be given the possibility of working in the centers of agglomeration in Europe. That will give economic incentives in these centers. There will be tax income that will go up. And then maybe we can talk about transfers and maintaining the structures in Greece. And then the pensioners will have to be supported. But I think that that would be the more promising or the less expensive model. Well, I did want to comment on your first point, which I think is wonderful. Well, you said, and rightly so, that transferring money to Greece arrives and then is sent back 100%. Well, now if we want to reinforce the complaint that I hear you making, and I would like to say that this was a decision from the Constitutional Court. I believe it was in 1963, and this was the alternative to reconstruction. Should this be made legitimate, or should we cover old debts? And the court decided that reconstruction is something that should be carried out before paying back debts. And for the Greeks, this is something that they are very happy to hear. And what you said, Mr. Konrad, you're an economist. You probably can judge that better than I can. And I'd like to say I really can go along with what Mr. Kirchhof has just said. If we transfer money, and that is the starting point that you would agree to, theoretically anyway, if this money is transferred to Greece, then it should be invested in a good way. That's the problem. If it goes to Greece, then it is used up or whatever, and then it comes back. And then you could think about, and this is also brings us back to the question of failure, and I would call this a positive failure, trial and error. So let's try to develop models as to how such investments through private individuals or other individuals, but not the state, where it could be wasted, how can we use this in the most effective way? Now, that would just be the only correction that I would like to make, and I'm sure that you will admit to that. It would be unfortunate if the Greeks came, and if the Greeks were to go to Greece, and if they were there as employers who were then to promise them their income. That would be neo-colonialism. I think somebody mentioned that already. And that, it was Mr. Beckett that said that, right? That would not be appropriate. It has to be organized in a different way. But I think the starting point is something which we should at least try. And if errors are made, then we can optimize it. But you're the economist, you'd probably tell me that that's silly. Well, this morning we stressed again and again the fact that the European Union is a concept for peace. We have lived in peace for 70 years in Germany, and this is thanks to the European Union, among other things. Now let's take a look at reality in Greece. People are dying because the hospitals cannot be funded. And in some big cities, not on the vacation islands, but the situation in some big cities are sort of like a civil war. It looks like it could turn into a civil war. We see that the rule of law no longer prevails. You could use your imagination and say everything is very difficult with the euro. We have some strong, small countries, and then Germany will come and they will leave the euro area. This would be a respectable situation in economic terms, but then the neighbors around us will be left to see what happens to them. I think that would be absolutely wrong, because then the Greeks would be upset, and then they would fight amongst themselves, and then we'd have other countries. I don't need to mention their names. The crisis would continue. The price we would pay would be much too high, also in economic terms, so that we should not decide now In other words, we should help Greece. That's a fact. That is real. That has been defined. It's now a question of how are we going to use this money most efficiently so that the infrastructure measures in Greece can be developed, so that the situation there can be improved. We could say we're not going to give them any more money. That is not the solution. You can talk about anything, but I don't think that is acceptable. I didn't understand Mr. Konrad in that way. Or, Mr. Konrad, I don't think your comment was quite that drastic. Assistance should still be given, in your opinion, but what you have to realize now is that it's going to involve some pain, and it won't help them just to shift the problems back and forth. But we have to recognize the fact that these problems exist, and we have to return to our principles. You mentioned one. That is our principle of correspondence. Maybe you can explain that once again. You've already said this, but maybe you can explain this once again to the audience. Because when this is in place, then it's a wonderful principle that helps us and protects us. That's how I understood you. I'll be happy to say that once again. This is something that economists enjoy saying. This is our motto, so to speak. In other words, the economy will work well if every part of the economy takes its decision on the basis of the consequences that will result. And these have to be seen comprehensively. So this is the case in an ideal world. And this is all in balance, so to speak. I'm sure you will think back to your days at the university. And when this is not the case, this is where the state is called upon to have a plan. The state will see to it that the external impact of such decisions will be reflected back on the decision makers, so that the decisions they take will also take these impacts into account. This applies to us privately, in our families, for companies, and it also applies to countries. So this was our currency union. That's how it was drawn up. It was Article 125. And it was such that decisions to have debt, that is to say, the state will assume the responsibility for this debt, and there would be an insolvency procedure in order to really remove oneself from this difficult situation. A banker once told me recently that this was something that was not close to reality at all. It is unrealistic because nobody wants to watch people die in hospitals. And of course, there is European solidarity. So the question is, how can we help them? Are we really helping if we try to invest in the wrong climate or in the wrong region for certain economic centers to develop because they have no links? If we try to open them up artificially, it's sort of like Berlin. Berlin worked in the past. There were economic activities, and it worked because only they got another 10% on top of what happened. So the goods were put on the trucks. They were transported to Berlin. The truck drove around the factory once or twice and unloaded the cargo, put it back on again, and drove back again. We could do the same thing with Greece. But I must say, this is very expensive. It would be much better to have economic activities develop there, where they would develop naturally and where the forces for growth would develop. And then maybe, perhaps, we would, rather than having social transfers to the weaker regions. So I think that this would be the least expensive solution. But of course, it's a question. Mr. Rocholl wanted to say something, and I also wanted to include our audience as well. And then the participants from the forum, and then the audience. Mr. Kirchhof, just try to be brief, because one thing's important to me. This is more personal. We have to watch out for the legal situation. and I was the rapporteur for Maastricht, and we had 4 legal criteria. We shouldn't fail with the euro, and the 60%, you mentioned that. But we also have to realize that if Germany has 82% indebtedness, and if they were then to say, okay, we're going to take one big jump and we're going to go back to legal situation, and this year we will reduce our debt to 60%, then we need 800 billion, and tax income is only 600 billion. So we would have to, even though we want to abide by the rules, we're somewhat illegal right now, but we have to approach that. We'd have to talk about the no bailout. Everyone is responsible for his own budget before his own country. This is something we cannot recommend to the Greeks right now. Or if we were to say every country, and this is what the treaty says, every state has to look for loans on the market. If they have a bad credit rating, then higher interest rates. So if we were to return to that, then we would have a totally different situation. But we would have major internal problems in all of the countries. The ECB secures the currency, not the states. So the simple idea, let me say this to you as a legal expert, we are returning to abiding by the laws because the laws are binding. That's one of our major aspects of our coexistence. It would mean major changes. It will only be possible with smooth transitions and not something that happens all at once to solve all the problems. And one final point, I'd like to emphasize Mr. Konrad's skepticism. To what extent can the state intervene? Well, in Greece, this is a country that has all the climate zones, so it has ideal situations for agriculture to a major extent. So maybe for at least a pertinent time, they were a net importer for farm products. And this is due to the fact that there was a problem with EU agriculture policy. So those who were active in agriculture stopped being farmers, moved to the cities, and then they found no jobs in the cities. So to a certain extent, part of the unemployment, I don't want to take it too far, but part of the employment is due to the fact that subsidies in agriculture gave incentives which were counterproductive. And I think we should prevent further subsidies from causing the misallocation from the past to be revised. So that's why I'd like to support what you said. I am a bit skeptical to what extent the state can intervene. Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite our participants to ask questions or to give statements. Gentlemen, did you want to add anything? Then I will open the floor for discussion immediately. Way in the back, I see a question. Can that gentleman be given a microphone, please? My name is Schwarzhaupt. What about indebtedness in the United States? They've also been pretty active in that area. And how do they cope with their problems? What kind of solutions or non-solutions have they come up with? Martin Koffel. Can we have a microphone, please?
You just called on is not an economist, so bear with me. I think you have to understand the structure of our debt, which is based in the states as well as at the federal level. And federal indebtedness is a problem because we keep reaching our debt limits, and there's a legal limit on the amount of debt that can be raised, and each year lately it's had to be raised, and it's become a factional or ideological fight with the Republicans not wanting to raise it and using that as leverage to get other political changes. So the federal debt is somewhat out of control, and our need to raise money is not because the fundamental economy is unproductive or is not growing, but we're being driven or consumed by entitlements, by, first of all, public service pensions, and by transfer payments to the unemployed, to medical programs, and so forth. So our debt problem is not driven by any fundamental weakness in the GDP or failure to grow productive capacity, or failure, for that matter, for consumer demand to go. It's driven by these transfer payments. And until a political decision can be made to curtail those, which has huge ramifications because so many people are involved in consuming those transfer payments, they form a huge political bloc in their own right and are behind one of the parties, the party that's in control at this point. At the state level, I mean, you have 50 states, and then we have municipal debt. So if you rank the GDPs of the states, it's something like this. It's California, New York, Texas, Philadelphia, New York City, a few more states, Los Angeles. So some of the states and municipalities are major users of debt in their own right. And the same problem applies at the state level, except it's uneven. On the two coasts, you've got great indebtedness, meaning California and Oregon and Washington, and New York and Pennsylvania have debt problems because they have huge entitlement problems that are consuming them. They're states that are very heavily unionized. As you move towards the south, you find the debt problem is much more under control, and as you move to the Midwest, the old industrial area, which is reviving, one of the things that's helping the United States is the potential for an industrial or manufacturing revival, which is just starting. So it's a political decision. It's not a need of the economy. The economy can produce. And if the political will forms to curtail the transfer payments, our debt will come under control.
Thank you. You want to add something from the panel?
I mean, I understand. Ich verstehe die Frage so.
I understand the question. This is reason for concern, what you have in the U.S., and we see that as well. It is really a reason for concern, and we can see that because the United States have problems in putting their debts on the market, and that's why you have 85 billion per month from the market. In other words, this is something that is removed from the offer and the supply. And that's, of course, something that is reason for concern. I read a very good blog. In Europe, we have a somewhat different problem because we have countries that have indebtedness which is not in their own currency. This is a currency that they cannot produce. In the United States, the legislator, the House of Representatives, or the Congress can buy up everything and pay off their desk. So the Fed can also get them to take on corporate bonds or government bonds. But in Europe, the situation is different. But this means that in Europe and the United States, for different reasons, they're both in a very difficult situation. The reasons are different, and the situation is very difficult. We always look at the dollar and euro exchange rates. How are the different currencies doing? In this blog I read, we have to consider this as two elevators, and they're moving down very quickly, and they stop at different points in time. And that's why this comparison of the two currencies is something that doesn't really tell us all that very much about the problems in one region or the other. The problems in both currency regions are huge. I'd like to add one thing. When we talk about the states in the United States, there is one major benefit. This no bailout is implemented. In other words, a decision was taken early on that interventions from other states or from the United States in general, Let me give you a specific example. The insolvency in Detroit, or the possibility of insolvency, is positive. We have to see this in positive terms. It is possible for there to be a default. But what is shocking here is how the German banks are involved. And they have receivables which they cannot get back, as was the case during the whole financial crisis. It seems to be a common pattern. Go ahead, let's maybe take another question. The next question over here. Michaela Albert is my name. The panel has been talking all along about the state. I'd like to know, on the basis of your experience, who is the state? At the end of the day, it's people who make decisions. Why do they forget the fact that I cannot spend more than my income is? And the reason for my question is, one thing I haven't heard is the assumption of responsibility when we talk about failure. We haven't talked about that. It was mentioned, assuming responsibility when it comes to failure. But you also talked about institutions, so it's a question of who assumes the responsibility for these terrible developments that we're going through now. Well, let me say one thing. One thing that you mentioned in your presentation was the identification of responsibility and freedom. A state can only give what it has taken in as tax income, and this is based on the annual principle. I think that we agree on that. We cannot really act in this way now because we have such high debts, and this leads to dependencies. We want to maintain our rule of law. We don't want to just do away with our debt by means of passing a law. We want to maintain the situation, and this is a process which means paying back the excessive debts, and of course we need to do away with new debt. That is one of the prerequisites. Christian Strenger? Thank you. One thing that moves me is the euro with the fixed exchange rate for all of the countries in the euro area. We haven't really talked about that because basically for countries like Greece or other countries that are maybe in a better situation will lead to a sort of holding on to everything. We can give them as much money as they want. And Professor Homburg in the FAZ daily newspaper said that if we don't have a fiscal union without a bank union, this will not work. And since we don't see this out there on the horizon, I'd like to ask the following question. Why didn't we think about coming up with a partial float? It might be difficult, but I think if we were to design this appropriately, then we might be able to achieve this. Before all the troubles in Istanbul, I was in Istanbul, and it's quite convincing what you see there. People from very important bodies said they didn't want to introduce the euro in Turkey. They do very well with the adjustments. We won't manage it, and this applies to the south of Europe as well. They simply don't manage to be as good and as efficient as the countries in the north. So that's why my question is, why don't we try to have a partial float? This would help those countries to improve their situation. All we do is call upon them for something. It's all negative, and we're not rewarded for any of this. What you say, a partial exit from the Eurozone for some countries, for weaker countries, this would result in major problems, especially in those countries that would exit the euro. A country that has to fear devaluation will have to consider the pending devaluation. This will have major negative impacts on the country. What they will have immediately is flight from the capital in this country because they don't want their assets to remain there and then be devaluated. So what you will see is they want their money to be safe, so there will be major capital flight. And that's, as Jean-Claude Juncker said, if things get bad, that's when you have to lie. But people are smart. That's the problem. And that's good, of course. They would anticipate this. So that is pretty tricky. It's simpler to solve the problem if you want to solve it in this drastic way and then give up the euro, the project euro. If you were to simply take the overperformers, Finland, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, if you were to tell them, give the others some flexibility to exit the euro, they can afford to exit the euro area, they would then have up valuation trends. That's not a problem. Even Switzerland can do it. George, they have wonderful prospects. They can freeze at that 110 or 120%, and lots of capital will go to their country. They will become an anchor currency. They can have capital funds. They can buy up half the world. And they can also make all sorts of investments, and they can even help the Southern European states with their fund. So this would be a strategy. And if we take the crisis, that would be, instead of having those countries in crisis exit the euro area. But we're living in a world where there is no alternative to maintaining the euro. Well, I hope you've all understood that in the right way. And I think it would be good if we were to consider a plan B. Whether we want to go this route or not is another question.
There are lots of questions, but I would like to ask you to be focused and concise. Otherwise, too many questions will remain open.
Ja, Karl Heusgen, genau.
Karl Heusgen, I've one or two aspects. One is, who is the state? Who's the government? Politicians have been mentioned, and the government and the political class that has made mistakes. But the question is, who has made these mistakes? I mean, too big to fail. Is this a political idea, or does this idea come from the economic context? I mean, is it too short-sighted to only blame the politicians for the problems we're having? And then the second question is, where is the origin? How did it all start? This is a crisis which has come over from the United States, and now we are blaming the euro. I guess you don't want an answer. This was not a question, it was a comment, was it? Who's the state? Well, yeah, of course, we can, of course, answer the question, who is responsible. The economy wants to deal with the state, and the state is a major client. So we cannot go and ask who is to be blamed, who is responsible. Is it the one or the other? Now, at least we should not make new contracts the way we did them in the past. Who's responsible? Who's to blame? That's not the right question to ask today. We should not play the debt game. We should go and solve the problems we are having. And we should also bear in mind what the first panel today has been about, and that's the aspect of chances or opportunities, which are also an aspect of the debt crisis. So we should not only focus on the economic dimension, we should also bear in mind that looking back at 2,000 or 3,000 years of history in Europe, we are living in a period of peace. So we are talking about peace policy because this continent has always been affected by wars, in particular in the last 70 or 80 years, and Eastern Europe, this becomes evident. One question concerning the systemic problems or uncertainties you've mentioned. What about collective strategies? Are there any collective strategies, or is this rather about the responsibility of the individual, i.e., is this about individual strategies, and does individual strategies mean that the overall approach is bound to fail? And is there a collective approach at all? Now, if a collective strategy is characterized by different laws, more equity to back state bonds, more regulation with respect to investments, we are dealing with a clear legal framework and rules, and such rules would be an important step forward and would certainly reduce the vulnerability of the system. Professor Kirchhoff, I think it is important to ask who is to blame. Now, why don't you have a closer look at us, i.e. the voters, who are not willing to vote for or elect politicians who tell us we have to limit ourselves and to bear with restrictions. Right, democracy begins with the voter. And normally voters ask much too much from the state, and political parties encourage him or her in this respect. No matter whether you deal with family policy or education, there are major expectations which are turned into legal claims, and then the political parties go and tell the people, go and ask for more. You can get more, which also enhances the burden of the next generation, which the current generation loves to ignore. And states are not productive in terms of the economy. States are productive in terms of culture or other fields. And that's a fundamental principle of democracies, law-bound democracies, and we have to focus much more on it. In 2005, there was one person who tried it via the tax law, but the media did not play along. They did not get the message across. So there were events for voters on the spot with a participation of maybe 6,000 people, and others got 8 million glued to their TV sets. It's not difficult to explain, but the media have to be willing to do so and to fulfill their information task. Benkendorf is my name. I'm from Munich, and I would like to thank the panelists for all these aspects and for your diagnosis, although your approach has been a very scientific one so far. Now, how do we get out of the mess was, so to speak, the underlying question. There is a mess because we are dealing with bad banks and with a debt risk and a credit risk, which is being considered, but which lacks the mathematical foundation, so to speak. We don't find the clear figures in the books and accounts. And then, of course, if I look at the involvement of the government amounting to 27%, I have to ask, in view of the disaster, will we be able to cope? The ECB, that's billions, securities, and governments that won't be able to pay back ever. Basel III has also been mentioned. The banks in Spain, for example, are against Basel III because they don't want to raise their own assets just in order to comply with the regulations. And they would not get any fair share prices as a consequence anymore. And Basel III, and this is why I'm telling you, this will only work if it gets the unanimous backing of all parties involved. Last but not least, we have to bear the Big Bang in mind. It will happen, you say, but we don't know when. Maybe it's true, but there is too much money underway. And the last point, I'm sorry, that was the last point. We have got 6 minutes left. Well, Professor Zinn in Munich says that the euro is not saved in Brussels, but it's fought in the streets of Europe.
Ich kann vielen Punkten nur zustimmen, ehrlich gesagt.
Yep, I agree. In many respects, I have to say, unfortunately. I don't see any objection. Now, a differentiated answer concerning your first remark. If I don't take the debt into my account, the debt exists nevertheless. Not including them in the books does not mean they've been paid. However, it's possible to achieve a balanced approach in the overall budget. You can thus outsource the debt. And according to the German Constitution, you have to inform the parliament about this particular approach, including the quota of repayment. Axel Hirschberg is my name. We've been talking about Greece, but I do see Italy, and I think Italy is a bigger problem, potentially. You described the particular relationship between banks and governments or the state, but you did not tell us that the banks are not catering for the needs of the private market anymore. i.e. they are not targeting their financial products to the private market anymore. Whereas in Italy, where the banks are almost passive in their role as creditors, we will have major problems soon. I agree, that's a problem, and it's not Italy only, it's also other countries where the banks are suffering. And, well, you know the concept of zombification, i.e. banks are compared to zombies, in particular with respect to their credit policies. Now, what should the relationship be between the growth rate of the economy of a country and the insolvencies? You could go and say the more growth, the more healthy the economy is, but that's not the case. Most probably because the banks do not want to consider the risk and take the money away from companies that should be insolvent because they are not economically viable anymore. In other words, we also lack monitoring instances, and the studies we get don't trigger the right results. Italy, I agree. Spain, this is not a problem of debt because the situation is not very different from Greece and other countries. But I do see a real problem with respect to the social situation. Look at Spain, a youth unemployment of more than 50%. That's a real problem, and there is no cohesion within Europe anymore, in spite of a single currency. Indeed, I agree. And it's a pity, nevertheless, to end on a negative note. And I would like to add France, nevertheless, because I think France is actually the problem we are dealing with. And look at the news you get from France. But then I don't want to mention France because I don't want to end on a bad note, withdrawn, so to speak. Now, this is going to be the last question. Maybe this is a positive way out. Dr. Achleiter gave a presentation recently, and he said Greece will be the Florida in Europe. First, the old people come, and then the kids go and visit their parents, and then they set up universities, and then you will have a booming economy. I mean, Florida used to be bankrupt, too. What do the panelists think? And end with hope. Well, Florida has relatively clearly defined property rights as far as land is concerned, and that's probably a fundamental aspect for Germans who want to spend their retirement age over there. There has been an initiative by the EU with respect to the property rights in Greece. It hasn't worked so far. And Greece, in our debate, by the way, was only one example. We are talking about the Eurozone as a whole. And that's what I also wanted to tell those in this hall who have reminded us of Italy and Spain. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. You are a wonderful audience. I love your questions. These are enriching, inspiring, and very smart questions. And we will go home and maybe rethink. And thinking and thoughts are the beginning of change. And maybe we will deal with failure differently from today. And I would like to thank the panelists, the forum participants. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you all. I've enjoyed very much these 2 days. And I'm looking forward to next years forum, and you all have save the date where you find the date. We don't know the topic yet. And there will also be another lecture in Berlin on 17th October, once again concerning failure and collective strategies. So I'm looking forward to meeting you for dinner.